Hello and welcome to this video overviewing multicultural theory and competence in counseling. My name is Kristen Kinsevich. I'm a doctoral student at Regent University in the Counselor Education and Supervision program. This video will cover core elements of cultural identity, models of identity development, multicultural competence for counselors, and multicultural considerations in supervision. We begin with the core elements of cultural identity. There are two models, the addressing model and the respectful model, that help us understand all the different aspects of what makes up cultural identity. And I also wanted to include a reference to intersectionality, which was introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. We'll touch on that in a moment. Here are the addressing and the respectful models. So addressing was Hayes in 2002. And you see these are acronyms. So for Hayes, it was age, developmental and acquired disabilities, religion and spirituality, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, indigenous status, national origin, and gender. So if you just are looking for kind of a quick and easy way to think about what types of multicultural categories there would be, that's a helpful model. Also, the respectful model, which I think focuses a little bit more on the individual, is religion and spirituality, economic class, sexual identification, psychological maturity, ethnic and racial identification, chronological or developmental issues, trauma, family history, unique personality, and location of residence and language. So you see there's a little bit more of a view of the psychological aspects of a person in the respectful model, whereas the addressing model is a little bit more of just categories that you might find on a survey or something like that. Intersectionality, I wanted to point out, is rooted in Black feminism, and sometimes it's misused or misunderstood as just thinking about all of our different identities that are combined, but it's really not about that. Instead, it's really about understanding the compounded oppressive systems for those who hold multiple minority identities. So that's where, let's say, being African American and a woman and maybe non-Christian in America would produce multiple layers of discrimination and minority identity. And so it would kind of compound the oppression that you're facing. So it's important to just understand and use that term correctly. Models of identity development, there are many, and so we'll just go through these. Perhaps the most famous, and the one that if you just hung on to one, this would be it, would be the Racial and Cultural Identity Development Model by Sue and Sue in 1990. You see that kind of abbreviation there. It's R/CID. That's how it's referred to in the literature. And I just want to point out that a lot of these identity development models are stage models, but that has certainly been critiqued in the sense that these are often fluid and kind of non-linear processes. And so stages may or may not quite capture exactly what's happening, but we'll present them in stages as these authors have. So first is conformity, and that's when you prefer the dominant culture. And then you might encounter dissonance, where there's some type of contradiction that shifts your view of things. It might be an event or a situation that you encounter that makes you start to wonder about your acceptance of the dominant culture. And there might be a resistance and emergence. Now, if this is primarily talking about someone who has a minority identity, they might have some guilt and anger over the fact that they have been ignoring their minority identity for all this time, and anger at the dominant culture. Then there's introspection, in which you might release anger and have a greater understanding of yourself. And then integrative awareness, in which you develop a secure sense of self. You can see the positive and negatives of both the minority and the majority cultures. Root in 1990 developed kind of just some categories, 4 categories or resolutions of biracial identities. And so these are really not stages, but 4 kind of choices of how someone might understand themselves with a biracial identity. One is some accept their identity that's handed to them from society, whatever that might be. or you can identify with both racial groups. You could identify with just a single racial group that makes up part of your identity, or you can identify with a new mixed race group. And so those are the options that were identified by Root. Now here we have a 5-stage model of biracial identity development. This was Poston in 1990. A lot of these models, it was around 1990, 91, so there was a lot going on thinking about specifically Black and white identities in America. So a lot of these, I think, emerged out of that. So in this biracial identity development model, you start off with a personal identity that's just yourself kind of apart from race. Maybe you're not thinking about race when you think about yourself. And then you might encounter a stage where you feel like you have to choose a group to belong to. There's some kind of pressure. Then you might go through enmeshment and denial. And that might be feelings of guilt or self-hatred of choosing one group over another. Then you move into appreciation, where you can see the positives of both cultures, and then integration, where a multiracial identity emerges. Cross 1991 wrote about the people of color racial identity model. So here you have pre-encounter, again, where the dominant culture is the norm. A lot of these are so similar. They start off with an acceptance of the dominant culture, and then in this case, encounter, something makes you aware of racism or of, something that would shift your perspective on the dominant culture. Then moving into immersion and immersion. So you're immersing yourself into the minority culture and connecting with that. And there's an immersion, something that comes out of a rejection of dominant culture. And so that would kind of emerge. Then internalization, where you begin to have a more secure sense of self in your racial identity. And then internalization commitment, in which you have a sustained commitment to the Black community or your minority community, and to the issues of the community. Now, Helms in 95 proposed a white racial identity model. And in this, the first stage is contact. And really, there's kind of a pre-stage where you're just kind of calling yourself colorblind or choosing to be colorblind, so to speak, and not really thinking about race. But then contact makes you encounter privilege in some way. You experience your own reality of privilege. And then there's disintegration. That's where white guilt comes in, shame. But then there's this interesting loop back around into reintegration, which sounds positive, but really it's not. It's kind of a way to resolve the guilt, where you start blaming the victim or the minority culture, and you start kind of doubling down on privilege and saying that maybe that's deserved and you've earned that. And so reintegration is important to understand in that way, that it's not really a healthy stage, but that it's a reaction to the guilt and shame. Then you move into pseudo-independence, where you look to people of color to manage or confront racism. So you're more open to it, but you're not going to actually lead the way in that yourself. And then there's immersion and immersion again, here where you connect with the white ID, and what emerges is a sense of anti-racism. And then autonomy would be a positive connection with a white identity and social justice. So you begin to see those two things not in conflict anymore. I think this integrated model from Hoffman in 1985 actually is great, and it kind of actually mimics the racial and cultural identity model that we saw earlier, although this date is earlier than Sue and Sue from 1990. So I'm not sure which one came first. A lot of these dates, there's revisions and future publications, but this one kind of parallels minority or persons of color and white identity kind of side by side. And so both, again, we saw with the Sue and Sue model, begin with conformity to the dominant culture. And then minority groups or people of color experience a dissonance, again, where you start to see that maybe there's some racism, you encounter that. Whereas white people would have a stage of acceptance where they may kind of dismiss or diminish racism, expect people of color to kind of get over it. They just basically accept racism for what it is. People of color would move into an immersion stage in which they would become angry about racism. And this could also apply to gender as well. So there is some mention of sexism here as well. But it's kind of immersing yourself in your minority status and beginning to feel angry about that in relation to the dominant culture. Over on the white identity development, there would be a resistance. So you would move from an acceptance of racism to kind of a resistance of racism, saying maybe it's a thing of the past. You might even double down and say that you're experiencing reverse racism. And so there's that resistance to growth there. Over in the persons of color side, immersion, this is where anger about racism leads them to feel that they can only really identify with their own minority group. And so they might avoid connection with white people and seek out people from their minority group. And for white people in the third stage here, retreat, they may kind of experience that feeling of white guilt, feel bad for people of color who have maybe had more struggles, and they begin to get annoyed with other white people who don't seem to, quote, get it. So that would happen in the retreat stage. Over for people of color or minority status, there would be next an internalization, where you start to see the negatives of your own culture as well. So it's not just us versus them anymore, but okay, maybe my minority group is not perfect either. And maybe I can start to reconnect with the dominant culture in a different way. For white people in the final emergence stage, they move past guilt and shame and begin to understand privilege a little bit more. And then both move into this integrative awareness in which both come to the conclusion that there's more to just their identity than just race or gender, if we're talking about applying these stages to gender as well. And you can positively identify with your own group, but acknowledge that there are positives in the other group as well. And so that would be the completion stage for both groups. So I think it's interesting to consider these side by side, and really think about the complexity of this particular integrated model. Now, I just also wanted to mention the CAS model of homosexual identity development, because obviously race is not the only multicultural consideration that we have. This is a very famous and well-cited model, CAS in 1979. And so looking at homosexual identity, there's first identity confusion, where the person becomes aware of same-sex attractions and maybe begins to experience a conflict in identity. They're not sure how to identify. So they begin to then have an identity comparison, where they maybe consider a gay identity, but they hold on to a heterosexual identity at that time. And then they would move into identity tolerance, where they hold kind of separate public and private identities. So they're embracing kind of both, but they've really kind of personally adopted a gay identification, but publicly they're not necessarily letting that show. And then identity acceptance is when they begin the coming out process. And in this, then that synthesizes their public and private identities. Identity pride moves into engagement with gay culture, but kind of a polarized view of, gay culture versus heterosexual culture or straight culture. And so there's kind of a dichotomy or polarized view there. And then identity synthesis, where they move past this dichotomous worldview into a more secure sense of self. So that's one of the homosexual identity models that it's important to be familiar with. Multicultural competence for counselors is important to think about. Sue and Sue in 2005 wrote an article that defined multicultural counseling. And in 2008, they began to propose counselor competencies. And this included three things: awareness, knowledge, and skills. So awareness is, awareness of your own cultural biases and your own cultural identity. and then knowledge of all other cultures. So you need to know about other types of groups and cultures, and then possessing the skills to properly intervene with a variety of cultural populations. In 2008, later on, Su and Su presented the multidimensional model for developing cultural competence. And so here they're saying we need to develop cultural competence in counselors on 4 different levels. First, the individual level to help people understand their personal biases, but we also need to look at ourselves as a profession and really be honest about the biases that are in our field and in research. We need to confront the organizational biases within our institutions. And then we also need to continue to address and confront biases within our society. And so all of those things are important for developing cultural competence as counselors. There's also the cultural formulation interview, which was put out by the APA. It's supported in section 3 of the DSM-5. And so this is important. It's a basically series of questions that the APA put out that kind of guides an interview that would be a culturally competent way of kind of doing an intake. And you would look for the cultural definition of the problem, taking into account and eliciting from the client how they understand their problem. And then you would look for cultural perceptions related to the cause, their context, and the supports that they have. So really seeking to ask about, why do they think this problem exists? And they even list some examples, like, some people have religious views that, help them understand this problem, or, other types of cultural views. And so what do you think it is? So you're really kind of going there on purpose and asking about cultural factors to see what they think the reasons are for the problem and understanding what their context is and who they would consider supports. And then it also addresses cultural factors in past and present coping and help seeking. And this includes asking the person about how they feel about the counselor-client relationship and if there are cross-cultural aspects to that. And so that's a helpful kind of guided interview that you might find useful. Now, multicultural considerations in supervision, there's a couple of names. Fong in 1994 talked about how there are 2 aspects in supervision to multiculturalism. One is multicultural content. Are we actually discussing multicultural issues? And then we also need to attend to multicultural process. Are there aspects of multicultural kind of dimensions coming up in the supervisory relationship? Then Wong and Wong in 2000 created a multicultural supervision inventory, and this measures the supervisee's sense of quality of the multicultural supervision, how they felt about it. And then Leong and Wagner in 1994, similar again to the year that Fong was writing as well, they addressed specifically cross-cultural supervision. So when there is a mismatch between the supervisee and the supervisor. So they wrote a seminal article on that. And finally, Bernard and Goodyear made a list of actually 10 supervisory behaviors in successful multicultural supervision. And I've kind of consolidated them here. First, kind of the supervisor's demeanor. So they're aware, providing a safe space, non-judgmental, non-defensive. So the supervisor is embodying kind of a safe space. And then looking at what the supervisor actually does, they listen, attend, validate, and support the supervisee's identity development process. So they're paying attention to that aspect of the supervisee. And then also, again, with that content piece that Fong mentioned, the supervisor brings up multicultural perspectives and topics. So that's important for us to remember as supervisors. I hope this has been helpful, and I'll see you next time.